everyone. Welcome to Journey of the Unordinary, a podcast where we will carry out intimate conversations with our guests to learn about their journeys to where they are today. In each episode, we'll cover where they grew up, what are some pivotal moments in their life, and their approach in life in general. I'm Jackie, a Chinese born New York City living girl who's perpetually on a hunt for her childhood hometown food from Kunming.
And I'm Chu Xing, a Chinese born Sydney living girl who loves exploring life and making meaningful connections. In this season, we bring you 10 episodes of 10 guests centered around tech and data. Join us to uncover their unique paths of these beautiful, unordinary people. Find a piece of yourself in their stories and let their adventure inspire your own.
Welcome to another episode of The Journey of the Unordinary. Today, we have our very special guest, Paul.
Hello.
I'm very excited to have Paul here because we've known each other for almost 5 years, or maybe more than 5 years. And Paul is the staff machine learning engineer at Canva. And when I was in Canva, we worked quite closely together, and I really learned a lot from him. So before we dive into the conversation, Paul, do you want to introduce yourself to our audience?
Sure. I'm Paul. As Trishan has mentioned, I'm a staff machine learning engineer at Canva. I've been at Canva for quite a while, actually. So that's about 6 years. I think that's in like corporate terms, that's a very, very long time at a company. But I've seen it kind of grown from maybe about 200 engineers when I joined to a lot more. Well, all I know is that 3,700 people at Canva right now, so it's definitely a lot bigger than when I first joined. Aside from that, I went from academia to machine learning, which was kind of a interesting jump, and that was quite a journey actually.
I'm sure we'll get all into that just in a little bit. Do you also identify with other titles besides machine learning engineer in real life?
Other titles, well, technically, I can use doctor because I do have a PhD, but I don't think I've ever really used it in any context except when I was in academia.
Gotcha. I was more like
I
hinting like I don't know, like a coffee lover, like a dad or
Oh, right,
something.
right. The less formal titles. So
Yeah, I don't know, like I guess roles.
there's like a funny story actually, because like I did have a colleague who did have like a who has a PhD as well herself, right? And every time she gets on board a plane, she would actually take the doctor because she told us I didn't work so hard in my life to not be able to use that salutation. But other adjectives to describe me, I guess nerd probably. I do spend a lot of time like on technical hobbies outside of work. I do love my coffee, yes. So does everyone else from Melbourne. And aside from that, I'm traveling. I think hiking stuff like that. So I think most people will call me a gym nut. So I do spend quite a bit of time in the gym.
Oh wow, wow. Okay.
But basically, I think Paul has a lot of hobbies and interesting stuff. You forgot to say you also do singing as well, and you
Oh
held a
yeah, yeah,
concert before.
totally overlooked that one. So I've been doing singing for about since the end of 2019, and how that got started was because I went back in Melbourne where I used to study. I had friends who and we were sort of part of like a little band. It's not like we do performance or anything like that, but because I used to play the bass and I would also function as backup vocals. The thing is, one of the things that I always wanted to know was like, how do I sing in a proper way, at least with some sort of training? Because I know that there are times when I know I can definitely sing better, but I just don't know how. So that's how, like, back in 2019, it's like I, on a whim, I just decided, oh, I should just go for singing classes, and I've been there ever since.
So I wonder how do you think the singing class and having like singing on stage has kind of like changed yourself? Like
Oh,
what have you developed? Not completely changed, but like what else do you think? Like does it, I don't know, grow more confidence or yeah, whichever you think.
all right. So back in 2020, at the end of 2020, and for context, the one of the things that my vocal teacher does is that at the end of the year, there's a Christmas concert. And her idea of a Christmas concert is basically we will all be at a bar, and each one of us would go up on stage by yourself to sing with a band that backs you up, or your song of choice, of course. And then you'd have to sing to like a whole bunch of people, which is about say 90 to 100 folks. And the first time I did it was like extremely daunting. I had to like down a beer before get down onto stage because I had to calm my nerves. And I think it went well. It went well for sure, but it felt like a blur on stage because when I just went through like the whole lyrics, and by the end of it, it's like, oh, I guess I'm done. So I just sort of just went through that. But I think the second time was last year was a lot better because now it's like I'm a lot more conscious of my stage presence. But I think that's still that one thing that I still need to work on is definitely my stage presence. So I think the progression over time has definitely gone from scared to death to something around some level of conscious competence now. Yeah, so I think it does help in terms of confidence, and I think projection as well, in terms of how you present yourself on stage or in terms of public speaking and stuff like that.
All right, so going all the way back to where you started your journey, curious if you can help paint a picture, whether it's from geolocation or other ways of the journey from where you were a kid to where you are now.
Okay, so all the way back when, all right. Okay, I was born in East Malaysia, so my parents were medical personnel. So, and as a result, like they got a transfer from West Malaysia. And for context, Malaysia actually has two halves, and one half is where Kuala Lumpur and the capital is, and that's called West Malaysia. The more rural area would be East Malaysia, which is in a state called Sabah and Sarawak, and they border Borneo. They're essentially like a whole large island in itself. My parents were transferred to Sabah, and that's where they got me. They were in an island called Sempona, and Sempona is a really beautiful. It has a really beautiful beach. It's a really nice island. They've got things like pearl cultivation, but you also, on the flip side, you also have pirates. So it's a very strange spot where pirates used to come from the Philippines and start attacking the place. But anyway, my parents spent probably about a year or two in Sempona, and then they transferred back to the city, the main city in Sabah, and that's where I was born. And then after I was born, I had to move back to West Malaysia in a town called Klang, where my dad's from, and that's roughly an hour's away from Kuala Lumpur. I pretty much grew up in Klang, did all my studies, had all developed all my nerdy interests when I was a kid back in Klang, and then moved over to Australia back in 2001, did my undergrad and my PhD in Melbourne, then did a bit of my academic career in the University of Adelaide, in Adelaide, naturally. And then I moved on to Sydney and started a career in industry since 2016 onwards. So I've been in Sydney ever since.
Wow, so cool. Pirates.
Yeah, they don't show up, they don't have eye patches. Sorry, disappointed, but they do. up with they do show up with lots of guns.
So your parents have like encountered them.
My parents have seen like the aftermaths of the fights because as medical personnel, right, they have to attend to both the police officers and
Uh,
also the victims.
that's
Yeah, it was a very wild time.
yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah, it still happens. I think. If I think even back in the 2010s, there were like still shootouts between the police forces and the pirates. It's around those areas. Yeah, it's because there's no kind of like a border enforcement. It's too wide an area to have border enforcement. Yeah, and they literally just come by boats and
Paul, I remember you talked to me talk about it before that when you were in high school, even younger, you used to be, I don't know, like a different, you feel like yourself was a different kid. Like, can you elaborate more on that?
oh, I think to an extent, like a lot of my interests are not somewhat different from a lot of my peers. I think my peers are very interested in English League soccer. And it's pretty much just what they talk about. And I wasn't really into that. I was definitely a lot more into reading about the sciences. So a lot of, I think even as a child, like one of my strong interests were in mathematics and physics, really. So much so that I told my parents that I would want to be an astrophysicist when I grow up. Yeah, that's a very unusual career choice for most kids. Most kids will probably go like, I want to be an astronaut or a doctor, but I had none of that. Yeah, I spent a lot of time reading encyclopedias, asking my mom a lot of questions all the time. So much so that she just decided, all right, I'm just gonna buy you a whole set of encyclopedias, and it's called this. There's a series called Tell Me Why, which basically has a answer question answer format. So I would just go through all the questions and answers because I just have too many questions. And I think it's kind of a way for my mom to offload the burden of answering questions. Yeah, so that's pretty much my childhood. I spent a lot of time just reading, like did a lot of like experiments by myself, which I never told my mom.
Such as
Such as playing with electricity, which you don't. I do not recommend. Yeah, stuff like that. So, but I did spend a lot of time like reading about physics because I think that's probably like the subject of interest for me.
I was gonna ask, like you said, you were also interested in math. I'm always curious as a person who didn't grow up liking math. What does that mean, like as a kid, when you're like fascinated by math? Does that mean you just like doing things with numbers, like where you can see patterns that's like that are mathematical? Yeah, can you help explain to somebody who like I just can't imagine what does it mean by liking math as a kid.
Sure. Yeah, I think I would say that when most people say that they're interested in math, it's more like, oh, I like to do some calculation. I can definitely do solve this equation, etc. But um, for myself, as a kid, like I had a very strong interest about why the underlying structures happen. So much so that I used to also bug my mom about why the division had to follow a certain way, and she just goes, "It is what it is. This is how division works, and therefore that's what it is." It's only I think in graduate school where you actually do learn like why certain things happen, but to a very good reason, right? I think if you were to tell a kid that this is why division happens and this is a number basis and etc., it's probably too layered and complex. So to your question, yeah, I would say that I'm always interested in how things work, I think. And a lot of like mathematical structures are really about how do you construct the systems of calculation, systems of computation. There's a very philosophical backstory to mathematics. I think that's quite fascinating, which unfortunately most people will only uncover in graduate school.
Paul, was there anything that you rejected doing as a child?
Oh, can I say housework? Is it- yeah, the I think the things that wasn't as interested in doing as a child would be stuff like, I think I wasn't into art as much when I was a kid. So I think at the point of time was the I had a very strong sort of like, I'm a science person and I don't do art sort of bent when I was a kid to a teenage phase. But I think I only came to have a much better appreciation of art as I journeyed along my adulthood. So when I was a child, it's like, yeah, I don't want to paint. I'm not interested in drawing, stuff like
And
that. So
but now you're more interested in AI generated art, right?
yeah, yeah, to an extent.
Yeah, like now I can become an artist too with
Oh yeah,
computer.
without having to go down the route of grinding of like figuring out how to actually do the drawing and learning like various techniques. But that being said, I think with AI art, this you would still need to have some level of appreciation, right? Because like they in order to make good art, you still need to have good taste, and I think there's definitely room to learning art on its own. By getting down to learning about drawing and all the kind of things associated with that.
All right, so Paul, you talked about you were really interested in mathematics, physics, whatnot, and then you also mentioned you had a PhD. So I'm curious, what did you study in your PhD, and like why did you decide to study in Australia instead of like somewhere else?
Sure. All right. So with the PhD, that was mainly out of interest. I think there were like there was a certain area in computer science that I was quite interested in, and that was like around randomized algorithms. But basically, randomized algorithms are data structures that allow you to trade off between some level of error and space and time complexity. So the typical data structures that we study in university, like the most important concerns are generally around space and time. So how much more memory to use, how long does it take to complete something. But as it turns out that if you are willing to accept an approximate answer to a certain level of error, you can then use that to trade off against space and time. So intuitively, like if you were to say look at if you want to sum up like all the items on your grocery bill, for instance, one quick approximate way is to just round up the numbers, right? So it's not going to give you an exact answer, but you can certainly calculate the total a lot quicker than just trying to perform an exact computation on the bill. So that's kind of how it all started. One of my advisors, right, somewhat well-known figure in network measurement in particular, and how we use randomized algorithms to measure what goes on in internet traffic. Now, for context, like a lot of internet traffic goes through these really large routers that you find at AT&T. So one of the main issues then is like, how do you know what the traffic composition is like going through all these large routers? And because the amount of traffic that goes through it at the time, this was around the 2010s, that it fills up, I think, about 1 terabyte per hour. So that's a lot of, if you're to collect everything, that's what's going to happen. It's just too prohibitively too expensive. It's probably a lot more. right now as compared to the 2010s. So a lot of the work was mainly around how do you design these data structures and algorithms to collect traffic and then basically get give you a rough idea statistically what's happening in your underlying traffic. Yeah, but I also got distracted halfway, so I ended up going into this slightly different area called compressive sensing. And in compressive sensing, I think in spirit wise, it's fairly similar to the whole randomized algorithm area. But what happens in compressive sensing is it's quite, I think intuitively, the easiest way to put it is that there are a lot of natural signals in the world. So take for example images. There is kind of like if you were to just basically measure everything, like your JPEG would probably be about 13 megabytes or something like that. Well, sorry, I take that back. Your image file would be 13 megabytes, but your JPEG would probably be about 700 kilobytes. And that's because they throw out 80 to 90% of that information in order to compress the JPEG to a form that is still has very low difference between what you get from a raw image file versus what you get in a JPEG. So the spirit of compressive sensing, based on this sort of observations of audio and image signals, is this: if we're going to measure signals like that, then basically store it and throw out maybe 80% to 90% of that information. Is there a way to measure that 20% of information at the start? Yeah, so it's kind of a whole subset of signal processing and mathematics where it's a whole area of like how do you design these measurements such that you can do that compression immediately. So it was a kind of hot area around 2006, I think, 2000 to about 2010. Yeah, it sort of overlapped with my PhD period. It was a fun area to work on. So that's how I got it. That's how I ended up working in like two areas.
What happened to astrophysics PhD?
Well, the astrophysics PhD didn't happen because I ended up going into engineering as an undergrad, primarily because from my parents' perspective, it would have been more advantageous to take engineering in Australia for PR purposes over astrophysics.
And the PR here you're referring to is the permanent resident of Australia, right? Yep.
That's right. Yeah.
Yep. Um, I got another question which is sort of related. So you spend your time in academia and then you transition into working in the industry. What was the reason behind that? And like, what do you feel that what are the things in academia that you have could be taken or applied in as like working in the industry?
Yeah. So the transition for me from academia to industry happened back around 2016. And the reason for that is that academia, I think over the years, and you probably hear, if you've ever been in academia, you probably hear quite a number of academics uh, complaining about this. And that's basically a lot of academia has sort of shifted from purely research oriented of like trying to discover something novel to an industry in itself. And I think it's gotten to a point where KPIs like the number of papers and citations you have has sort of trumped that intellectual curiosity component. And I think to a large extent that's kind of true these days. I think a lot of good feedback can probably be gotten from online, from experts in different areas, to peer reviews. And I'm not saying that peer reviews are completely bogus mechanism for gatekeeping. It's not. I think there's probably some merit to having to having peer review because there's any sort of idea needs to stand up to scrutiny for sure. But I think there's that kind of obsessive publish or perish culture that happens a lot in academia, especially over the past, I'd say, 10 to 15 years. That's definitely makes it a lot harder to kind of get there. So I figured like I could get better challenges in industry. There's a lot of application of data science and the kind of statistics work that I would have done in academia, just that now reoriented towards a business context.
And why did you choose Canva?
Well, I did not start off at Canva actually.
Ah,
Right after academia, I went into a tiny startup called Image Intelligence. It really is basically spun off from this larger parent company, which is also a startup. And what they do is retail security camera. And basically, what happens in that is that the machine learning team within that company was spun off to form its own tiny startup. What we do there is things like people detection and facial recognition. So as video streams start coming in, and this was back in 2016, where a lot of these image models were still not as powerful yet. So the kind of things we would try to do is to basically use something like your VGG and ResNet, the sort of early models that we used to have in deep learning to then figure out if there's somebody in security camera footage. So that was quite a challenge in itself. I think we started off as a five-person team and we had to build a product in 6 months. So that was just straight out of academia into industry. That was definitely a huge learning curve on my part. So I had to kind of wear a lot of many hats because being a five-person team, I couldn't just necessarily concentrate on the machine learning component. I would have to do things like the back end and the infrastructure for the startup. Uh, so to recap, high learning curve, but I learned so much from that period. There's a lot to do. I'm still good friends with like one or two people from that team, even though we've all left for that company. And then I joined Canva back in 2017. I had a mutual friend who works at Canva. And then he said, like, well, you should join Canva. There's a lot of interesting things going on in Canva. It's a bit more of a unique company as compared to where I was before. So that's how I got in.
Paul, how does it feel working back then as a smaller startup when Canva was only 200 people versus now? Like, what's the challenge?
Yeah, the so back when I started at Canva, I think you could literally know everyone in the company, and that's just virtually impossible these days. I think there are lots of new hires every Tuesday. So at Canva, new starters start on Tuesday, not on Monday, and it's a company culture thing. I think there are lots of times these days when I meet someone and I said, "Well, I've never seen you before. Like, have you just joined Canva?" I said, "No, I've been in Canva for what 2 years now." Like, oh right. So that sort of thing happens. I think it's very difficult to keep track of who is doing what, who is coming into the company, uh, and I don't. And also in the early days, you could probably have lunch with the CEO, but that doesn't happen anymore. So I think it's probably a function of growth. The as to challenges, I think the main challenge has definitely always been like around organization. I think around the 2019 2020 period, Canva went through this period of really massive growth in headcount, and the it was definitely a challenge to have structures in place. You know, things like onboarding processes. Before that, it used to be a very casual, less formal onboarding process, and suddenly, I think we went the other way a bit too much. And I think we're somewhere in the middle right now, which is great. But the one thing that came out of all of that is that I think Canva and lots of new joinees do tell me that is that Canva has a very good onboarding process right now. I think everything is documented. If you want to do a setup, it's literally every set of instructions to set up your machine and anything like that is all documented. So I think that helps so much in sense. Still, communication overhead has always been a challenge. I think there's that whole Metcalfe's law thing where it's like, well, you've got n people, and it becomes an n squared connection of people talking to each other. So I think there's definitely a big shift from a flat, very flat organization when I started to a bit more hierarchical at this point. I think there are more like things like group leads and team leads, things like that with formal titles. So I think it's probably an evolution of startups, really.
Yeah, so I was saying, going back to still Canva, zooming in on Canva, but taking a little bit of a different perspective because you've been there for 6 years as a machine learning engineer.
Mhm.
So I wanted to know more. I'm curious about how has the list of tasks that you've been solving at Canva changed from the early days till now, or maybe it's like a different kind of model, and then now it's like, oh, like this new model or new problem. So from like a technical
Yeah.
perspective, how has it changed? And then from a career development perspective, you were more junior back then and now you're like a lot more senior, so how has it evolved in terms of career development as well?
Okay. Yeah. I think I could probably split this into two parts. One
Mhm.
being like the evolution of the tech stack rather at Canva, and also from a personal perspective of like how my career developed. From a technical perspective, we started off with very kind of like in the early days, it was a huge challenge to get data. I think we had to spend a lot of time just trying to set up uh, all the data piping and getting data into a great state. It still happens to a certain extent for different areas in Canva, but there's a lot less of that. So I started off in the search and recommendations team, and that was because that was the area in Canva that one had the highest impact if we were to improve the data. And number two is that also it's the area with the most amount of data that you could get, which was perfect for machine learning applications. The so when I started, I think a lot of the work we had to do had a lot of a data engineering component to it. I think so much so that we ended up having a proper data engineering team over time. There was definitely a big shift from using something like Spark clusters to now having a central data warehouse where we have one source of truth. So when I started, we didn't have a proper source of truth either. So a lot of that consolidation has taken a lot of effort, and I think that has helped a lot. So number one, data. I think the other side of it, I think, is that there is definitely a greater use of deep learning, and I think that's basically a function of how deep learning has been such a it's caused such a big inflection point in this area. I think the it was when I started. I think the kind of models that we used were fairly limited to your standard linear type models in recommendations. But I think over time, as we started to unlock more data, things like the visual components of an image, for instance, then that's where deep learning really came to the forefront. So it really deep learning requires a lot of data, which we have a lot of, but the issue would be to set up the data pipelines in order to get those models starting to learn and also perform at a high level, high performance level rather. From a personal perspective, I came in as a machine learning engineer and then kind of evolved to a point where there's a lot of like the technical challenges became more of like a, I guess, from it started to I start to take a further view out each time, I think. And that's kind of what happens. Like as a staff machine learning engineer, it's more about strategy and where should we allocate resources to and figure out which what sort of directions or tech stack or tech solutions to go. But whereas when I started off, it was more about what features should I put in this model to make it 10% better. So it's kind of a from a very sort of granular view to a much higher level sort of view. I think that's kind of like the evolution there. I do lead a team now. There is definitely a challenge in getting alignment between product, different parts of Canva, which may have overlaps with our work, and trying to herd the cats, so to speak, into one consistent direction where everyone will be able to do their best work. So that's kind of how it's definitely evolved.
Paul, what is one common misconception about machine learning that you want everyone else to know? Just one. I know
Ah,
there's more.
I think there's a common misconception that what we do is magic, and to a certain extent, I think stuff like ChatGPT has probably made it more mystical than it should be. But really underlying it, there's like a lot of kind of a trial and error and experimentation and a bit of math sprinkled along the way to get to this point. The other side of it, I think, is that the other misconception I would say is that if you do, I think a lot of my stakeholders think that if we have a whole heap of data, then it's job done. But that's usually not the case because it's not like this machines just miraculously learn from data. And but to a certain extent, I think deep learning has enabled that a lot better than it was, uh, maybe a decade or two ago. But it's the, I would say that data quality is still paramount. There's a lot of studies, there's a lot of research papers that show that even in the training of any large language models right now, having good data quality really helps to improve the performance of these models. So I think there's that misconception that just because you've got a lot of data doesn't necessarily mean that you've got quality data. And I think that's still important to emphasize.
And just going back to nowadays, it seems like you're leading a team. You need to strategize, be on the, I guess, the balcony so you can see the whole dance floor. How do you like keep up learning as a lead of a team? Like, how do you keep up with all these information?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll say I don't because there's a whole stream of everything about large language models, and I try to do my best each week. I think just try to go through papers by myself or with some of my teammates. But it's definitely a lot more difficult than it was right after there's this whole explosion with large language models, and GPT-3 was the start of all this craze in like the large language model space. I think there is definitely somewhat of an inflection point in that sense. And again, I'm not saying that these things are magic, right? There's quite a bit of trial and error and lots of money being spent trying to train these large language models. But there is a lot of degrees of freedom. There's so many things to discover. Right now I think the big thing is to put images in and audio straight into the same model. Uh, but to your question of like trying to keep up, I think I would. I think in general it would have to be. I would have to be very selective of what I read. There's just a deluge of information coming in every day. It used to be every week and maybe every month, but now it's every day. And I think it's just virtually impossible to keep up with everything. Yeah. So I think of it as to like within the business context, like what are the sort of problems that we want to solve. I also think about how the kind of workflows that we have, how are they going to be impacted by these developments in new technology, I think, and then work backwards from there rather, and what are the sort of associated technologies that would happen. The other thing that I got as a really good tip from a talk given by an OpenAI, someone at OpenAI, I forget his name, but basically it's just that because these things are evolving so quickly, what we can do is that we can list down a whole set of capabilities that we want out of all these technologies, and then maybe if they don't solve it right now, just come back and revisit them in about 3 months and see if they do solve that, and then you can then keep up. I think it's probably a better way to like sort of reduce that scope, and you should sort of think about like what sort of problems do I want to solve that these things probably don't solve yet, and then see if it solves it in about 3 months, basically.
Paul, so talking about AI, how has, I don't know, just GPT or AI in general helped you? Maybe just in like in life, how like what is some of the interesting things you've done with it, or like helpful, impactful things you've done with it?
Yeah. So one of the things I think that it does help a lot is with combinational creativity, and that's basically taking various combinations and then just crossing them to see what sort of ideas that comes out of it. I think that's something that GPT does really well. Now the and I'm going to step back a little bit and talk about a little bit about what computational creativity is, right? So there are sort of three levels to that, but the second one is combinational creativity, but the highest tier you could get is transformative creativity, and that's basically in the difference is that if in combinational creativity you do know what the box is and there are like sort of components within the box. In transformational creativity you don't even know what the box is, so you have to develop the box first. And I think that's something that gpd can't do, and I think most of the time the average human being can't do either. So I can't fault these machines for not being able to achieve that. Yeah, something like coming out with relativity would be an example of transformative creativity. Now, to get back to that is that I think GPT and this sort of large language model tools, they are really good at helping you as a brainstorm tool. And I think, there are lots of times where I just sort of mash together ideas, or maybe I've written a piece of code, like say a decoder, and I'm thinking about how can I improve this. So I would run it through GPT, and then it would give like suggestions. Now, not all the suggestions obviously play out, but there are sometimes gems that you can find, and you can kind of use that to then refine your thinking in the next round. I think that helps a lot. uh, I think the other side that's kind of interesting to me would be this whole use of AI agents. I think we're still not there yet. And the AI agents is basically a concept of using these large language models have to kind of come up with a little bit of planning, forward planning, and then use tools to achieve certain goals. So, for instance, maybe my goal would be, I want you to find me 3 bedroom houses, and my budget is X dollars, for instance, and then this agent would then trawl the web, just go through all the various sites and do that compilation for you. So it really offsets that manual work, but in order to do that, it would need to sort of have an idea of like, what is a good 3 bedroom house? How does that fit into the user's idea of what a house is? Uh, what is the budget? Like, how is there a way for me to sort of find something that's on the periphery, etc.? There's a whole bunch of things that humans naturally do. I think that this agents still have a bit of trouble with, but it definitely is sort of like the talk of the town in the Bay Area, I think.
Nice, nice. So with AI, right, you list a lot of things that is really helpful. But with new technologies, people can get scared of its impact. So do you think that AI actually will make us a better world? So some counterexample, they'll be like, oh, AI is taking away the job. Oh, in the future, AI will be conscious and will kill all human beings, right? So there's all these, I guess, hypotheses about the future with an AI. What do you think? Do you think AI will make us have a better world?
I also just want to add a few points before you give me the answer, but maybe just not really thinking about it from the black and white perspective. It's like, oh, is it better or is it going to be worse? But more like, if you have the power to, like, what kind of world do you want to create for your kids and also for the future generation, like with AI? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think this is a definitely very big topic, and there are definitely a lot of nuances to this, but I'll give my perspective. I would say I'm more on the techno optimist side. So I'm definitely more optimistic about technologies like that. I think sure, I think, any sort of technology, and like if you take a look at other technologies that we've developed along the way, not just in software or AI, is that technology on its own is pretty much a tool, right? There's an amorality to it. That's, how we use it is really how the builder uses it, so to speak. Um, with AI, there definitely is a kind of conundrum as to whether it would benefit or not. I think in my opinion, I kind of fall into the Jevons paradox side of things. And what I mean by that is that in Jevons paradox, that when you have some efficiencies that you come out from technology, like say, I think I'll give you an example. It's probably easier to explain that. So when we had more powerful computers, I think the prevailing thought is that we will need more computers because now they're doing everything else. But instead, we ended up with a lot more computers, and that's because it turns out to be such a good general purpose technology that the demand has increased, despite the fact that we've been more efficient and we've had more powerful computers. The the demand for compute has just increased because it can be used for a lot more than just that. So in similar vein, I think it's kind of like how in AI as well. I think it will probably transform certain jobs. I think some jobs that we used to take for granted will probably disappear. But in its place, as we find more users for AI, I think there will be a lot more jobs in that sense, which is kind of like the root of Jevons paradox in that. Um, as to AI risks, I think, at least from my understanding, we're not close to artificial general intelligence yet. But I also don't know if it's going to be a phase transition, right? So I don't know if it's like maybe tomorrow we might just get AGI. I think it's highly unlikely by the looks of it. A lot of our architecture right now is really based on interpolation of information rather than extrapolation. So it's not like it comes up with a very creative way of, and also it doesn't have some level of self recursion. And what I mean by that is that it's not able to improve itself and come to a point where it will just reach AGI and potentially artificial superintelligence. So I think we do have time for that sort of takeoff period for the AGI. I think it now is definitely the time to kind of understand like what sort of things like alignment happens. How do you do alignment? How do you mitigate the risks and things like that? But this sort of questions have also happened for any human organization as well. You know, how do you align a whole group of people to a particular interest, right? Like to a large extent, like a whole nation state is in some sense a super intelligent organism because you have lots of people working on certain problems and things like that. And how do you align governments in the interests of the people all over the world? It's also a generally very hard question, but it's not like it cannot be done, I think. Yeah. The related question about how I would want to build the world for kids or kids in the future. I think so. To to that question, there is kind of like this interesting philosophical video that I watched a couple of some time ago, and I think the it basically boils down to the kind of two trajectories we're going, right? So it's either which sort of trajectory are we going in terms of like, are we going down the Wall-E world where, you know, all the human beings are basically just on leisure cruises all the time? Everything's just about consumption, everything's just done for you by robots, and there's just literally no purpose in life other than to consume? Or are we going down the more Star Trek route where we have purposely not gone full automation and everything in order for us, for human beings to still reach their potential, to kind of like still um, flex their creativity, kind of figure out a purpose in life? I think for us it would be more beneficial to go down the more Star Trek world rather than just completely going down the Wall-E world where everything's done for you. To a certain extent, I think AI tools and a lot of these technologies enable us to get to a point where we can go up that kind of self-actualization level of Maslow's hierarchy. I think we should definitely. I think there's kind of a danger of us just kind of falling back to our baser instincts, right? Of just we'll just consume, get enough food and lots of leisure time, you know, without much of a purpose in life. I think I think it's important for us to reach that level of self actualization. And I think technology to a large extent can help us get there. But again, like it's kind of a critical period right now. Like how do we achieve this? Right? Yeah, there probably needs to be some level of self regulation, and I don't know if I would say that regulation is. I think regulation probably does help to an extent, but you don't want to build systems where they are too regulated. You know, if that makes sense.
So, what does it mean for you personally to have a meaningful life? We were talking about the self actualization, Maslow's hierarchy. What does a good, successful life look like for you?
For myself, yeah, I asked myself that question too many years ago. I think from it's very clear, at least to the consistent theme of my life, that gaining knowledge and even contributing to that body of knowledge in the world is kind of a cause that I care about. So to a very large extent, like I think for me that learning and also figuring out why certain things happen, you know, let's say within my area, for instance, has always been like, to explore my sense of curiosity and also to kind of share that knowledge is that something that I care about and do want to progress on for sure.
What do you think? What do you think people get wrong about you, or maybe what you want people to know about you?
uh, yeah, I asked my wife about this question, and I think the the answer I got was that everyone thinks I'm a really serious person when they first meet me. There's a kind of a conception that, sure, of course, I do my job professionally, of course, and I think there's kind of a conception that I take everything really seriously and that I'm very stoic, etc. I'm not. You can probably ask my wife now, and I think she just says, "Yeah, just I don't take things really seriously sometimes." I think I spend a lot of time like making jokes a lot, so I think yeah, can probably ask my team members that too. So I think that's probably the biggest misconception.
I had this linger question from like way earlier. Can I squeeze in one more question?
Sure. Yeah.
Um, we were talking about how your parents asked you to study engineer because it gets you the permanent residency of Australia. I think it's kind of a
Yeah.
recurring theme for a lot of us from like certain parts of the world where we
Yeah.
make certain decision not because we want to, but because we think it's
Mm.
like the best way for where the parents tell
Yeah.
us is the best way for our life. So do you think it's the right decision from your parents to push you to do that? Or maybe like on a larger level, like do you think it's right for us to have this mental model? Okay, let's disregard like interest to a certain level, or just like think about the best way to have like a good life first, and then maybe think about, oh, what do I really enjoy doing?
Yeah. In my case, I think it's worked out only because I've always had a very strong technical bent. Now, I wouldn't say that that's something that's recommended for everyone. But that being said, so I'll give my brother as an example. Like he did software engineering, graduated because my parents like pushed him towards the direction, but he didn't really like it. So he did it for 7 years, but after that he went into medicine. So he sort of started his life over. But then again, I think Australia is great in that sense because it has that level of safety net to allow you to do something like that. Uh, so if you do have the opportunity, yes, you can. It doesn't mean that anything in life is too late. I think you can definitely have many directions in life. But to the broader question, I think, and I always tell this to everyone else, is that I think parents in particular, because they want the best for the kids, they tend to kind of like fight the last war, so to speak. So it's always based. So there's this kind of maxim um, in military, right, where basically militaries always fight the last war. So they prepare for what they know, but the future is always kind of very different from what they expected, and that's how armies lose wars because they were completely unprepared for a whole new development of what things are at the moment. And I think to a certain extent, I think parents tend to fall into that trap where I think during my time, a university degree, sorry, during my parents' time, a university degree was something that is highly valuable. And I think these days there's a lot more folks with a university degree than it ever was before. So I would say that to that extent, that you I think everyone needs to have a think about what their future would look like. And sure, I think you probably take some guidance from your parents, but really they're trying their best based on their past experience and how things are now with a lot of there's such a huge acceleration. I think the landscape is changing a lot faster than it ever was before. I think it's far more important to really have like the basics in terms of like critical thought, I think, and also discovering like what you're truly interested in and go down that route. I think it would be far more beneficial in that sense.
Wonderful. Thank you, Paul. Yeah, so where do you think people can learn from you?
Um, I have a defunct website which I do want to get a hold on, but you can find me at paulgym.com. But I think Twitter is probably the best spot. So if you go on Twitter, find PTULS, and you'll definitely find me.
Correct.
I spend an
PTULS.
inordinate amount of time on Twitter.
Okay, PTULS. And then what do you want to learn from our audience? How can they help you?
Yeah, I would love to hear thoughts about like what they think that AI should be doing for them. I think there's definitely a big discourse. I think I've seen a lot of questions about things like copyright and job displacements, and how does this affect my future? Yeah, it'd be great to kind of get a sense check of like how people are feeling about these things.
All right, Paul, thank you so much for coming on today. I feel like I've learned a ton. I definitely know more about why you call yourself a self-identified nerd. Very interesting discussion about AI and everything. It was really nice meeting you today.
Yeah, likewise.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Journey of the Unordinary. If you haven't already, please subscribe so you won't miss an episode. You can find us on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you are listening right now. Also, if you know someone who might enjoy the podcast, please share it. If you like our conversation, please help rate it and give us a review so others can discover the podcast and join us on the same adventures.
Join us next time as we carry out intimate conversations with our unordinary guests to discover their journeys to where they are today. See you next week!